Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting.
Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Braaten. Today we have back with us David Ramirez. Welcome back, Ramirez.
Good to be on.
We are picking up where we left off in Saving the Sons of Missouri. This is part 2. Last time we spoke, you laid out the situation. Essentially, we're not in Kansas anymore. In other words, the world in which we were born doesn't exist. And our default mindsets or frameworks or assumptions aren't accurate and are often misleading and off-putting to people who are from different times of birth, different generations. So that's kind of what the situation is leading up to today. Where are we today?
Yeah. I think where we are today is we have had several cultural revolutions, as we talked about in the first part. And those have, I would say we've had 3 major ones. But whenever you have, as we learn in physics, whenever you have an action, you have a reaction. Now, when I say that there's going to be a reaction or that there is a reaction, I'm not kind of falling into this old understanding of there's always a pendulum, and as far as things go to the left, they'll come back just as far to the right, and vice versa. Countries, people, communities, churches, they do change and they do drift, and maybe it's a zigzag pattern, but many times they do drift one way or the other. So the idea that we're just going to pendulum our way back through momentum, I think, is a false hope. But what I'm talking about is that when you push people, they do typically, at least some of them, push back. And there's at least the seeds there for when there's a revolution to have a counter-revolution or a snapback, kind of like stretching a rubber band. The further you stretch it and the faster you stretch it, it's going to snap back, or at least the potential is there. There's potential energy there. So
is this similar to Hegel and his dialectic, or this is just built into the nature of things?
I wouldn't know. I'll just confess a lot of ignorance on Hegel. I mean, I read a little bit in college, but it always kind of bored me, I'll be honest. So
okay.
I just don't care about Hegelianism that much. But so I just am totally unqualified to make a comment on that. Also, I just wanted to let the listeners know that as you mentioned, or I mentioned, I don't remember who, but somebody mentioned that I did a presentation out in Wyoming on this idea of saving the sons of Missouri and talking about the generations and what we can do to, turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the children to the fathers. If people want to watch that, the Wyoming district very nicely put it all online. Could you add a link?
Yeah, I've put that link in the first installment.
Okay, great, awesome.
In the show notes.
Okay,
but
great.
I can copy that into this one as well.
Sounds good. So I know that you just built up to saying, let's look at our situation now. But I frankly would like to go back in history, because I think that there's a great example of a snapback during a very, very, very revolutionary time. I'm not trying to say that our time and place is necessarily as revolutionary as France in 1980 or 1789. Yet at the same time, I think a lot of the parallels are there. I've received a little bit of pushback from people on this analogy, and usually it goes along the lines of, well, we don't have fighting in the streets. And I kind of give them a sideways look and go, really? We haven't? Actually, we have. It's certainly not to the extent that that was going on in France. And certainly we have not had as much civil turmoil and overthrowing of governments. But I'm pretty sure we're all aware of some highly unusual elections in recent history, and a lot of civil unrest. So if people want to quibble over whether there's a difference of scale and scope, that's fine with me. But that has nothing to do, actually, with the underlying principle. France in 1789 went through the Great French Revolution. Obviously, there is a big buildup there and lots of different things that fed into it. And interestingly enough, there was a snapback or a reaction, or if you want to call it a counter-revolutionary reaction in the aftermath of the revolution. And I think that it is worth seeing some parallels.
Okay. What are those?
So, if you think about the French Revolution, the revolution happens, and it's interesting to note where it happened. It happened in Paris, so a city that was very influenced by the Enlightenment and also radicalization of a lot of the common people, so to speak, in Paris and in that urban area. But there were also lots of other places that reacted pro-revolution throughout the French countryside, and typically it was linked. There's a great book, by the way, called "Religion and the People of Western Europe," and it's by Hugh MacLeod or MacLeod. I don't know how to pronounce it. And that book is an amazing, comprehensive review of religion in Western Europe since the French Revolution. And it starts out by saying that this is, the defining incident to bring us to, modernity. Kind of that's the watershed between early modern Europe and modern Europe, if you want to call it that. And I totally agree with that assessment, generally speaking. And not just in broad categories, but in terms of the religious faith of Europe too. The French Revolution was the first revolution that did not actually claim the mantle of the cross. You can think of all the other revolutions previous to it. I mean, of serious scope and nature, and they. So the biggest one in Western Europe before this would be the English Revolution or Civil War. When they depose their king and do all of the Cromwell craziness, and those people who were leading that revolution were self-professed Christians. Now, whether people want to argue about whether or not they were acting in accordance with the scriptures, I just want to lay that aside for a second and say they definitely were using the banner of the cross. They believed that it fit in with their Christianity. Or if you want to go further and say that some of the people weren't actually sincere Christians, they at least felt the need to put it under the banner of the cross of what they were doing. If you go back into especially what we're more familiar with as Lutherans, and you look at the Peasants' War, the Peasants' Rebellion, that was certainly, all sides claimed the mantle of being Christian, and this was following Christian principles, blah, blah, blah. But the French Revolution, it was different. And a lot of those rural areas, interestingly enough, where people were more pro-revolution, was areas where the Huguenots had been strong, kind of the French Calvinists who, of course, were persecuted under Roman Catholic France, especially after they lose their limited toleration. But what's interesting is that it some people, not all, but some people flipped from being anti-papal or anti-Roman Catholic Church or anti-priest to being anti-Christian. Now, again, as a good Lutheran, I think you can be very anti-papal and very pro-Christianity and the church and Christendom. But it was interesting how that slide went. And I don't think that that's just a phenomenon of Protestantism, because a lot of Catholics will try and make that play. And say, oh, the Reformation, Luther did a nominalism, and we're all at fault. Us Protestants are all at fault. I don't think that holds a lot of water. But regardless, that's for another time and place. But what is clear in the French Revolution is that you have a shift. You have a shift from the discussion and the argument on the religious side being from, should we be Catholic? Should we be Protestant? Should we be tolerant of both or whatnot, to an antagonism against the church itself, not just an antagonism against the Roman Catholic Church or hierarchy, but against the church itself. And that's what was a huge leap forward in a bad way in the French Revolution. And this made a link between politics and religion. Of course, a lot of Americans, I think, especially in previous decades, would say that, politics and religion could or should be as separate as possible. And yet, if you look at the long history of the world, they typically are incredibly interwoven and linked. And in France, during the Revolution and then in the aftermath, they become even more tightly linked, in terms of like the common man out in, the provinces. It is very, very clear, and MacLeod does a great job of going through this, that the places that were already committed to the church and tended to be more opposed to the revolution, they grew more committed as time went on to both the church and resisting the revolution, especially as it became clear that the revolution's true aims included overthrowing Christianity itself. And the opposite was true too. People in regions that were less committed to the faith, usually coupled with large support of the revolution, and then as the revolution went on, once that was uncorked, they grew more and more irreligious. They fell away from the faith. And so
the sides hardened? Yeah,
the sides hardened, and which is typical when you have a conflict of any sort. The sides hardened, but they didn't just harden in opposition to each other, but linked with religion. And so this was actually true for the aristocracy as well. If you think about pre-revolutionary France, the most irreligious sector of society, I mean in terms of class, not region, but class, was the aristocracy. Religion had been out of fashion because of the Enlightenment, and was seen as, kind of like, oh, that's for the peasants, and these are old-fashioned beliefs, whatever. They can have their opiate of the masses, as, the communists would later say. But after the Reign of Terror, especially even so soon as in the later 1790s, there was a big sign of a return to the church. Not only were the peasants in religious, anti-revolutionary areas getting more fervently religious, but also there were signs that the aristocracy was returning to the church. And then under the Restoration, the aristocracy, generally speaking, became strong supporters of both the church, and here it happened to be the Roman Catholic Church, and clerical power, and that was linked with their political motivations. Now, I know some people would say, well, this is just because they wanted to use the church to uphold their politics. But if you look at the evidence, that is just not a fair assessment, whether you like it or love it or whatever. It's not fair. There's lots of documented accounts of individuals undergoing a personal conversion or a taking the faith seriously. But regardless of individual conviction, the aristocracy as a class became way more committed to the church after the revolution than as compared to before.
Is this the time with Bossuet? Am I pronouncing his last name right?
I don't know.
Bossuet.
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 The Catholic.
The Catholic bishop.
Yeah, I think he was earlier.
Okay.
Do you want me to fact check you?
No, it's okay.
I think that he was 1600s.
Okay. Where do the Jansenists and Pascal come in?
Well, I mean that really, I if I can just be honest, that would pull us rather further afield.
Okay.
Because I'm just more looking at the classes. And my French history is reasonably good during the Revolution, but I'm certainly not an expert in it. Really, the main point I have is that the common man who was rather religious and conservative in his thinking, especially the agricultural linked peasants versus the urban dwellers, those who were already committed to the faith and to the ancient regime, even if they didn't like all of it, became more attached to it. And this was also true of the aristocracy. And there was kind of a religious revival, as MacLeod says, and others have said as well that I've read, that there was this genuine revival. Now, again, some of that revival is probably lost in the numbers, even though we don't have lots of data or surveys or anything. I mean, they didn't have a Pew Research Center back then. But some of that is probably lost in the numbers because the snapback or the revival isn't across the whole population, but it's only within a segment of it. And that's why I think sometimes when demographers today, especially religious ones, will poo-poo a snapback going on in today's American Christianity, I think that they're missing it because while it's not a huge movement of overall numbers, it is happening within very particular demographics.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how does that snapback look in our day?
Yeah. So for our day, I think that it would be expressed most properly as an intertwined cultural or political and theological movement. Okay. Which I think just makes sense. I don't think you have to know a lot of history or even know a lot about modern America to understand this, because there's been these revolutionary forces that are cultural and political and theological. And we've had wave after wave after wave of this. And we're really getting to kind of the end game, frankly, in terms of how far our society as is will function. I mean, yes, the 60s happened, and that was momentous, and arguably perhaps the most damaging of those three phases in terms of sowing the seeds. But, life went on, and a lot of the effects didn't filter down until the 70s. The political correct movement that you and I grew up through, it was certainly important, but I wouldn't put it on par. And then the Great Awakening of, roughly 2015 to 2018, I mean, that really is kind of taking the gains of the 60s and of the late 80s and 90s and really making a lot of hay and, kind of reaping the rewards of those revolutions and pushing America much, much, much further into, kind of, a revolutionary state that really has utterly lost its moorings. I think this can be proven by a lot of people who are older than us, boomers, who will say, who they used to say, pre the Great Awakening, America is a fundamentally center-right country, and it's fundamentally a Christian country, and it's fundamentally, a stable cohesive country. We just need to deal with X political problem, X religious problem. They view it as a fundamentally cohesive, working nation or churches and stuff like that. But we've got these problems that have been injected in or have arisen up. And I think that it's very notable that once you get into the Great Awakening, kind of like Obama's second term or a little bit later, and then certainly after COVID and all the BLM riots, I think a lot of people had to take a long, hard look and say, you know what? I don't think this is the America that I woke up in or that I was born in. And I need to wake up to the reality that maybe we do have a much more serious systemic problem on our hands. And so I think that is the roots of a big snapback to that. Now, whether it'll be successful, how big will it get, I don't know. But I do think that there's hopeful signs of people, number one, recognizing how far we've come or how far we've fallen. And number two, that people are actually, moving in a good direction. Not everybody. Again, I think how you read the numbers, you're not going to see it unless you break it down further than just the entire population. But I do think it's inevitable. I don't think like I said, I don't think you need to know a lot about history or even a lot about the current situation to know that if you're taking a country this far where it has not been before, at least to this level, there's going to be a reaction.
Mm-hmm. So you said that this is a mingling or an intertwining of cultural, religious, and political things. Where do we see that on those as we look at this landscape? I mean, it sounds like you're saying that the Great Awakening or the what happened in the 60s and the 80s not only had political themes, but also religious and obviously cultural then.
Sure. I think that an easy one to kind of slide us into more specifics is on transgenderism, frankly. Because, I think we mentioned this in the last episode where, I remember being a pastor down in Illinois, in Lincoln, Illinois, and hearing, on the radio or in the newspaper or somebody shooting me an email of an online article about transgenderism being, something that needs to be celebrated, understood, and whatnot. And this was in the early teens. And I'm sure that the young kids would call me a boomer for my reaction, but I, of course, said that's ridiculous. There's no way. And here we are. We're through the looking glass. The most ridiculous things ever are being proposed, and that is going to make people reconsider. And that's where the seeds for the snapback really lie. And it's kind of like you can only push people so far before there is a reaction. Now, sometimes you push people really far, and if you do it smart enough and slow enough, you've cornered them, and then they lose. But they probably will actually have a moment before they lose where they're willing to turn and fight, kind of like a cornered animal. And frankly, with what's gone on in the country over the last 10 years, I think a lot more people are there now than certainly in the 60s or in the late 80s, early 90s. There is still that veneer of, these revolutionary forces will fade away. They're a fad. We're still comfy. We're still prosperous. Things aren't all that bad. We just need to, change the oil on the good old car and polish it up. I don't think people are there anymore. And I think you do see that in attitudes towards transgenderism. There's a very interesting survey that was done in 2021 and 2023, and Americans, this is as a whole shifted. Okay, so the question was, do you believe that there are only two genders? And the people who affirmed the obvious biological reality of just two genders went from 2021 from 59% to 65% just 2 years later. Now, again, surveys, there's lies, blank lies and statistics. So, I mean, numbers can be manipulated or presented in a way that you manipulate the person reading them. But this is across the board, actually. It's not just all Americans as a whole, but there was even movement among Democrats in those 2 years from 38% to 44% affirming that there's only two genders. And so these are not statistically insignificant. Again, you have less change with Republicans because they tend to believe that already. It was only 87 to 90. I don't have the numbers in front of me of what the margin of error was, but that might have even been inside the margin of error. Independents, though, moved 6 points, 60 to 66. But to me, what is the most interesting thing is who moved once you start breaking it down by generation. The silent generation, I'm certain it's within the margin of error. It's only 1 percentage point from 68 to 69. But every generation shifted. The boomers moved 6 points in the correct direction from 62 to 68. Gen X, the best generation, of course, moved from 65 to 71% affirming that there's only two genders. So in 2023, we had the most percentage-wise of the correct answer. And if you notice, there was a 6 point difference with the boomers, and there was a 6 point percentage with the Gen Xers. But millennials, it was 9 points from 51 to 60. And Gen Z, it was even bigger. It was 14 points, 43 to 57. So while, of course, you can say as people age, typically they are more sure of their positions, it is given to the young to shift more quickly and radically. But I find it interesting that, it just goes up and up and up as it goes down the generations, the shift. And it isn't just on the transgender issue, it's on other issues. But what I think that you see here is that you did have a high watermark with the Great Awakening, pushing, every type of leftist position under the sun. And we're seeing a snapback. And hopefully that's not just like, okay, how the left usually operates, where they push and then they give up a little bit of ground, but not a lot. They have that ratcheting effect of just moving slowly, giving up a little bit of ground, but then going further in another generation. But I think that the data really points towards a potential for a much more serious snapback. You can see this not just with the transgenderism, but also with the question whether homosexual couples should have the right to marry one another. That actually, believe it or not, has been trending down, and the biggest difference has been with young people. So it's not huge movement, but it certainly isn't the peak at the very tail end of the Great Awakening, from, around 2018 to 2020. It's been trending down. And of course, if you break it down even further, not just to generations as a whole, but especially with young men, if you are willing to accept that, generally speaking, the Democratic Party is supported by not only political liberals or leftists, but typically people who are either irreligious or liberal Christians. If you're willing to accept that connection, which I think is undeniable, I know that people can come up with anecdotal evidence of exceptions, but that's not really what we're working with. We're working with the big picture. It is astounding the percentage of young men who identify or lean towards the Democratic Party cratering. 2016, 51% of young men ages 18 to 29 identified with the Democratic Party, or at least leaned towards them. And as of 2023, it's down to 39%. I mean, that's a cratering. That's 12 points. That's huge. And the trend continues to go down, 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 down. So I'm sorry. Did you want to ask me something?
Well, so this is indicative then of what? That there is a snapback in process, or so this is how they're choosing to snap back?
Yeah, I think it's a snapback in process, and it is going to be naturally, because it was a religio-political revolutionary time in the Great Awakening and in previous times or waves. That means that the religious and political affiliation is going to overlap. It's going to have a high amount of connection. And so when we look at these political reactions or shifts, especially with young people, that gives us a picture of where that snapback is happening. And of course, people who are in their, 20s and 30s, I mean, you're looking at the future leaders of the country. And not only are you looking at the future leaders of the country, but you're looking at where they're going. I mean, obviously, you have a tendency for generations and the people within a generation to tend to get more conservative as they grow older, because they have kids, they get married, they have more responsibilities, they actually have to pay taxes. But this is happening very young and, frankly, rather quickly. And I said it was religio political because it's not just political. I brought up two issues that are both theological and obviously political in nature because of laws and statutes in the United States. But you can see this with religious attendance too. I wish I could, show the readers the graph that I'm looking at, but it's very interesting to see when you break it down again by men and women, religious attendance by gender and birth year. We have a snapback developing, but particularly with young men. I don't think this is odd. Young men are more adventurous on average than young women. Well, men are just period more than young women. God made men to lead. There's a very interesting question that I received when I was doing this presentation because I think it was Mrs. Ristow who asked me out in Wyoming, well, if women follow men, why did the women not follow men and become so liberal, especially young ones, previous to the snapback? And because I'm going to assert that they are going to follow men eventually, or at least some of them. And I said, yeah, it's a good question. Women do follow men. The only question is which men. And as many people have stated before, if a woman does not look to her husband as her head and her guide and leader, then she'll look to the government, if it's a nanny state government like we have. And especially, you look at all the stats on the liberalization and the feminization of women at institutions of higher learning. That's the answer.
Yeah.
So I don't think that one is hard to figure out, but it is a good point to bring up of why did the disparity happen in the first place. But yeah, men are snapping back in terms of increase of religious attendance rate, and so it's kind of like when you see, if you're looking at any type of graph and you see something going down, 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 but not only is it leveling out, but it's actually a little bit on the rise. Obviously, this doesn't change the fact that younger generations don't come to church as much as older generations. But that's the whole thing about prediction, whether you're looking at societal trends or stocks and bonds or anything where there's cycles, you look to see a switch. And I do think that we are in the beginning phases of a snapback. Again, if you asked me what my hope and prayer was that it would continue to grow and be bigger and stronger. But I don't know that. I don't know. I hope and I pray, just like the Christians in France hoped and prayed that more and more aristocrats and more folks of the common people would indeed get more serious about the faith and more serious about resisting the revolution. So,
and maybe we'll get to this in our third section, but it raises a question like, so then what are the obstacles that the church has that are keeping this snapback from coming into our midst? Like, it seems like we would want this.
Yeah, I guess I would push back and say I think some of it is already happening, but how are we throwing up roadblocks, or how are we not greasing the tracks even more?
Yeah.
You know? Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something. I mean, that's kind of the culmination of everything that we're looking at.
Okay.
It's interesting that the return to serious, convicted faith in France, I think, is also, there's evidence of this happening among Christians who actually show up. So I found a chart on Ryan Burge's Twitter page, or X, whatever you want to call it, views of the Bible among white weekly attending Christians. So it's a very specific demographic, and it's not broken down by generation. But it is a very interesting graph, because back in 1980, the percent of here specifically white weekly Christian attending Christians, you know, that the Bible is literally true, as opposed to inspired but not literal, and as opposed to a book of fables. Back in 1980, it was around 50% that believed that the Bible was inspired but not literal, and it was in the mid 40s where the group was that believed it literally true. So pretty close to parity there. Now it's shifted. And it's shifted to the point where in 2022, you have a full 60%-ish of white weekly attending Christians believing that the Bible is literally true. So it's gone up. And I think that, and then the people who say it's inspired but not literal, it's down under 40%. So you're seeing no longer near parity kind of a stasis thing, but actually these groups separating. Why? Well, because as times get more clarified, as you said, the sides harden up, and people who are very committed to the faith, and then you have the culture not just being neutral towards Christianity, but being opposed to Christianity vehemently, they tend to have those hard conversations of, is this really true? Do I really believe it? Are we going to stick with it? And so you do have kind of a winnowing or a separation. And I think you see that in that chart. I think that you see it too because of the linked, religio-political situation of our day with political ideology of weekly attending Christians. Back in 1970, actually, you had about the same amount of white weekly attending Christians who were conservative and moderate, right about 40%, and about 20% liberal. This is all self-description, so take it for what it is. But what's interesting is that now in 2022, the liberal white weekly attending Christians, they've declined down to, in the low teens, like 12, 13%. So they've almost been cut in half, frankly. The moderates have gone down from 40-ish percent, 40%, to under 35. So that's not a huge shift, but it is declining. And then the conservative white weekly attending Christians has shot up from 40% to 60%. So again, the sides are hardening, and I don't think that is because political parties are manipulating Christians, even though political parties always want to do that. But I think that it is actually a reflection of an obvious truth that the parties are no longer arguing about shades of the same color. It's one thing to say, you know what, I'm a Christian. I believe in the Bible just as much as the next Bible-believing Christian, but I think our tax rate should be a little bit higher or a little bit lower, or we should have, this policy or that policy. But there's just fundamental disagreements, and there's chasms between not just political orientations, but how those line up more and more and more with religious convictions.
In other words, whereas you might previously say that the various political parties in the United States had the same goal but different means by reaching it, now we have totally different goals.
Yeah, I mean, obviously,
that's an oversimplification.
Yeah, of course. I'm not going to throw out the caveats. There's lots of caveats to be said by that, but there was to lessen what you said just a little bit is to say, while there were a lot of shared, or at least more shared, overarching goals and assumptions and coordination with kind of the tenets of basic Christian belief, now that's no longer true.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine.
No, I was going to say, back when, in the last section that we did in the first interview, I made a big deal about the rise of the nuns, either totally unaffiliated people or moving, to a different, not different religion, but, just basically people who are just dropping out of religion. There's good data on that to back that up. What's interesting, though, is where some slight gains are, and that's actually in what they label evangelical Protestantism. As opposed to mainline Protestantism, the Catholics are losing the most in terms of people switching, in religious switching. They're bleeding big time. It's kind of interesting because, when we were in seminary, there were sadly, some big names that went to Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. And I think a lot of those people got swept up in the propaganda that, Rome and Constantinople were the place to be. And of course, just like always, the Missouri Synod is, 20 years behind the time, if not more. And it's interesting that, Pew, I know it's a little bit older, but Pew came out with one where the only people who were actually gaining a little bit in terms of leaving and joining were evangelical Protestants. This was back in 2014, so again, it's a little bit out of date, but I would assume that either it is still true that, generally speaking, conservative Protestants are still gaining a little bit, or in the very least, what we can say is that we're not bleeding nearly as bad as the mainline, and certainly not the Roman Catholic Church.
This means that people are leaving, or even
the ratio between people leaving and joining. Now, if you're just doing a population, that's why breaking down these numbers is really important. Because if you're just looking at how many adherents over time, you're just basically doing who's actually joined, whether by birth and baptism or by people joining and switching versus death or leaving. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about that. I'm doing a comparison back and forth between people who disaffiliate, for instance, with the Missouri Synod, versus who comes in by like adult confirmation or something like that. Because, I mean, you know the stats on the Missouri Synod just like I do. I mean, we're declining precipitously, but that is mostly a demographic issue of people not having kids and not getting married and having kids. And that's a whole nother conversation, important one, but that's not actually the apples that I'm comparing. I'm comparing people who are choosing to leave a denomination versus the people who are choosing to join that denomination. And so, the Catholics are bleeding profusely on that. There's, again, this was back in 2014, but 6.5 Catholics left per every one that joined. I mean, that's just like a gaping wound. Mainline, 1.7 left versus one who joined. But the mainline, of course, is plummeting way faster than the Catholics, but that's because of their death rate and their lack of births. And you could throw in immigration in there too as another factor. But what I'm just saying is that even as late as 2014, in terms of conversions, if you want to put it that way, you had in evangelical conservative Protestantism, for every person that left, that chose to leave, 1.2 came in. And that's kind of notable and interesting to me. And yet, at the same time, even if we don't know that that ratio is, reasonably close today, I pretty much can guarantee you, just looking at our numbers, even though they're going down, and you look across other conservative Protestant groups, yes, they are generally going down because of the death rate. We don't seem to have the same problem of people just massively leaving who already were. And they're not leaving by death, they're leaving by choice, unlike the Catholics and the mainline Protestants.
So we're seeing the sides hardening. Where are we seeing it harden the most? Particularly with the question that you received about women following men. Is that where the biggest divergence is?
Yeah, among young people, absolutely. The snapback, no matter how big or small people think it will get, is definitely being spearheaded, generally speaking, by men and by young men. And the battle of the sexes is on. And I think that every family that has a young man of 20 to 30 years of age can definitely sympathize. Well, you like to use the word empathize, but can definitely understand this problem. Oh man, I got the sigh. I'm going to get in trouble. I better
fine.
I better shape up. So if you talk to any guy who's between 20 and 30, they will tell you that the dating market, so to speak, is just horrible. Now, of course, every generation complains about not being able to find a spouse. And of course, women between the ages of 20 and 30 complain about the same thing. So it's easy to just kind of brush this off and say, hey, that's what everybody said in my day. That's what everybody said in your grandparents' day. That's just the way it is. Get over it. And there's a time and a place to say, get over it and get working and figure it out. At the same time, I do think that just like we need to acknowledge that the economic and theological and political problems of our world are more troublesome than in the past, man, the battle of the sexes is on, and that is reflected in the data. And again, it's socio-political, it's intertwined, and you can see this with a lot of the data. If you look at some of the most recent stats and polls in terms of support in the recent presidential election, Harris versus Trump, I mean, it's pretty incredible how big of a gender divide there is. If you go to the boomers, there's a big divide. I mean, it's over 30 points. You've got men supporting Trump over women supporting Harris. You've got a pretty decent gap with Gen X too, even though it's smaller, by the way, and further to the right. If you go to if you go to the younger cohorts, though, millennials, it's a little bit smaller of a gap than the boomers, a little bit bigger than the Gen Xers. But if you go to the Zoomers, 18 to 29, well, I guess this was 2 years ago, but people who are now 20 to 31, I mean, the gap is incredible. It's over 50 points. Women were plus 40 Harris in that age demographic, and men were, like plus 13 Trump. But that's over a 50-point difference. And it's radically bigger than any other gap in any of the other generations. There's a very interesting chart that is from the General Social Survey, and they you can see it in my presentation if you want to check it out. But it shows the political ideology. Now they track this among white Americans, and they've been trying to track it since 1895. So this is a long-standing one. And of course, you see that men tend to be more conservative, but not always. Interestingly enough, at the turn of the century, there are times in our history where men will kind of take the lead on more "quote unquote" liberalizing or pro-change. But men tend to be more conservative. But just in the last few years, that gap has widened incredibly. I mean, just incredibly. The line over that century tends towards a moderate liberal movement, because the country as a whole has gotten more liberal. Mm-hmm. But in the last 20 years, that gap is no longer a gap. You look at this chart; it's like a gaping alligator mouth. Mm-hmm. It is. The men have shot up from right about 2000 towards the conservative side, and the women have, on this chart, gone down drastically towards more liberal political beliefs. This is unprecedented in the history of our country. It is really amazing, and I think that if you talk to any young people, they will affirm this, and I think they're right. And this isn't just in the U.S. You see this all across the world. You can see this kind of general liberalizing trend all the way up until about the turn of this century. And then women veering to the left and men veering to the right. South Korea, Germany, the UK, regardless of where the population started in terms of a right-left spectrum, it's the distance that is just incredible and unprecedented. So yeah, the battle of the sexes is definitely on, and that is a huge roadblock to marriage, family, children, and just the general welfare of young men and young women. And it is a burden that, unfortunately, I think a lot of older generations do not get the huge depth of.
So what happens? So if you have this general, widening of sort of political ideology between men and women, what should we expect in terms of what do you get when you have unmarried men?
What you get when you have unmarried men. Well, when you have a bunch of unmarried men sitting around in a country, guess what's going to usually happen sooner than later? A war. They're going to march somewhere. I mean, that's typically what happens, because young men in any conflict are the fighters, and many times used as cannon fodder by people who will lead them or direct them. So, I mean, you know how it is with teenage boys. You have them, I have them. If you don't give them something productive to do, if you don't give them a plan, if you don't provide leadership, they're going to do stupid things. I mean, they are, you know. You were a teenage boy. You were.
I remember doing those stupid things.
Yeah, exactly. Me too. Sometimes I still do. But, you know, so young men in America are going to get organized, and they are increasingly getting organized. The only question is, and they are going to do things. Every generation does things. Even not doing something is doing something. So the only question is, what are they going to do? And how can the older generations contribute to providing them with help, leadership, advice, and support for good things, or for bad things, or for stupid things? And to narrow it down even more, how will the church react to their very legitimate complaints, problems, struggles, especially on a very personal level when it comes to marriage? Mm-hmm. How will the church respond? And that kind of brings us full circle to the very beginning, where, you know, the worst reaction would be, oh, well, you don't have it so hard. Just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. A slightly better response would be, you know, I sympathize or understand your problem. I acknowledge it, but I don't really know what to do. I guess even a slightly worse response would be, I acknowledge your problem and I give you bad advice, you know? So no acknowledgement, no help. Acknowledgement, but bad help. Acknowledgement, but incompetency. And then last is where we should be trying to work with especially young men, but also young women as well. Acknowledgement of the problem, and to have competent advice and solutions. Because it is a revolutionary world out there, and we've lived through them. You know, anybody who thinks that the good old US of A is just steaming along, doing okay, I don't know what to say to them. I think they're living in La La Land, and I don't think that they have come to grips with how bad things are and how many things have shifted. I mean, you've got 50 or 100-foot statues of pagan gods in good old Texas. You've got, you know, transgenderism celebrated openly. You've got groomers reading to kids. You've got riots on the street. You've got a government that locked down churches for, in some places, over 12 months, if not more. I mean, this is not normal. It's not good. And most of the people who plotted or pushed these things are pretty proud of them, and they think that they're righteous. And this has affected the younger generations to a far greater extent than you and I, or especially our parents in the older generations. And so not only do we need to acknowledge it, and that is a big part of it, but also to help them. And the most fundamental aspect of their lives is, you know, home and the church. Yes, are some of these young men going to go on and be political and cultural leaders? Yes, absolutely. But that's not every man, woman, and child. I mean, the church needs to help them understand where they're at, what they should think, what they should do as a Christian facing these challenges. But also on the home front, we need to help the battle of the sexes not be a battle, but rather a godly unions of men and women. Some girls are going to come around, and women tend to, once they get married, drastically shift to the right in the modern world because they've been fed a bunch of leftist garbage for, their time in college. And, then they realize, yeah, you know what? Actually, God wants me to be a wife and a mother, and, maybe I'll still do some work. But what's my priority? And once a woman has a priority of being a godly wife and mother, then her politics, regardless of what they were beforehand, radically shift. And and that's where there's a lot of hope. But what to say to these young men and how to treat them is definitely a huge challenge, because some girls will wind up following this snapback, regardless of whether it's big or little or whatever. But we definitely have a big movement of young Americans, young American males who are rejecting where the revolution has taken their country and the society in which they're in. And they want to understand where they stand. Where do they stand in the church, where the church stands over and against these revolutionary movements, and how to actually form a family and how to get married when so many of the girls are radically to the left of them, which is totally different than in previous generations. I mean, just anecdotally, I mean, I know tons of boomer couples. Their politics are very, very different from each other, but it just doesn't take up a big portion of their life. Because number one, they came from a time when the political spectrum was nowhere near as polarized. But number two, they weren't incessantly talking about it. But ever since the Great Awakening, and especially COVID and the 2020 election and all that kind of stuff, I mean, politics takes up a much bigger percentage of the pie in our lives than it used to, because it's affected us so greatly. And so those marriages aren't happening as much. And if they are, they're not going well, or they're ending. People tend to marry people who are like themselves, religiously and politically. And that's what is so dangerous and so, frankly, sad and tragic about people today. Not only did they grow up in an upended world, but the guys and the girls are on radically different sides of many of these fundamental questions.
So it seems kind of bleak, but whenever there are lots of problems, it seems like there's also a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we could pile up lots of cliches. That would be fun. Like, it's always darkest before the dawn. And I say that with kind of a gallows humor, because I think that what you referenced as the Gen Xers being kind of a bridge generation, I think that is a gift we can give the young people. On one hand, to say, yeah, we get it more than your grandparents, and we do understand because we've been paying attention. And frankly, like you and I, we have kids that age, right? So this isn't abstract. I might not have the personal experience in the same way as my children or other people roughly their age, but at the same time, I'm talking with them every day. I mean, I'm not unaware, but I do think that on one hand, we do need to have that acknowledgement and actually have good advice, but also I think a little bit of gallows humor is something that maybe our generation takes a little bit too much delight in, but it is good because you got to be able to look at the situation, no matter how bleak, and say, yeah, well, that's the way it is. Maybe we'll make fun of the cliches. Maybe we will cry in our beer a little bit, but no, I mean, it is what it is. You get the hand that you're dealt, and let's get to work. And in hard times, there's always lots of opportunity. And that's the other thing. You just don't know what's around the corner. I mean, in those dark days, the reign of terror, I mean, lots of people could not have imagined that you'd have a restoration of the monarchy. Not like I think the Bourbons were perfect or anything, but lots of people who were pro-revolution probably thought that, oh, hey, it's the age of Aquarius and we're never going back. And yet there was a dictator, Napoleon, and then there was the Restoration. And yeah, I mean, the revolution, obviously, if you look at France today, was successful in the end. But there's lots of twists and turns, and it's not like we believe Francis Fukuyama or whatever his name is, that there's a natural progression of political ideology till you get to the end of history. It's not how it goes. We believe in fundamental things, like God's word, like the family, like these things, the devil can only spit at and pervert so far before there is a quote unquote natural snapback, or God decides to change pieces on the chessboard. And you just don't know how that's going to go. Most of the Israelites thought that it was over during the days of Hezekiah, when the Assyrians have their hands right around the throats of Jerusalem. And then they wake up and they can see all the dead bodies. You just don't know how things are going to go. And that's why we've got to have answers and hope, so that these young people not only get married, but also they can face the challenges of their day and help us. I mean, it's a two-way street.
Right.
They are the future leaders and sometimes the current leaders, and they do know the game on the ground, at least in terms of their situation, far better than us. And so the generations have to work together. The hearts of the fathers has to be turned to the hearts of to the children, and the hearts of the children to the fathers. Because the devil always wants to sow dissent within a family, whether that be a literal family, or whether that be a nation, or whether it be the Missouri Synod. And that's what we have to minimize, because I think a lot of it has already happened, and I think there's been a lot of lost opportunity. So I hope that we get on the ball.
And that brings us to what to do about it.
Yep. Yeah. And I think that's going to be a fun conversation, hard conversation, because nobody likes to get told what they need to do. So,
yeah.
But we're saving that till next time, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
It kind of reminds me of one of our friends' books, right? Telling people what to think.
Yeah.
We're just going to tell people what to do.
Well, I think that was an up-off speech this year.
Oh, yeah, it was.
Yeah. I hear it was pretty good. I didn't bother listening. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. It was a good speech.
Thank you, Ramirez, for your time. And we'll pick up with part 3 on what do we do about it.
Yeah, sounds good.